welcome you to this Grandpa Don podcast. For you today, I am going to be talking about my grandparents. Question was raised by one of you grandkids about my grandparents that you didn't know too much about, and maybe I could give you a few stories, and here it is my opportunity to try to do that for you. On this particular podcast, I'm going to speak first of all about my father's parents. So my father is Clarence Knudsen, and his dad was Andrew Knudsen, and his mother was Ida. Ida Lundgren was her maiden name, and she was, of course, a Knudsen when she married my grandfather. So I knew them as Grandpa and Grandma, and Andrew and Ida were their names. I can just begin by telling you that my grandfather, I do know, he was born in 1895, and his birthday was on New Year's Day. So that was quite a memorable thing, to have your birthday on the first day of the year. I don't know my grandmother's dates right here, but that at least gives you an idea of how what period of time they were living. My grandfather Andrew's father and mother, they were Knud Knudsen, K-N-U-D, and then K-N-U-D-S-O-N. And Knud and his wife Annie Oswald was her maiden name. Some of you have seen the picture of me being the little boy in a 4-generational picture. And so the lady that I'm talking about, that is my great-grandmother, whom I really never met or knew, even though I was a little child when she was still living, according to that picture, as you see. She is the oldest of that picture, and my grandfather to the right was her son, and he was the oldest of the family, as my father was oldest of his family, and then I was the oldest in my family. So that was part of the picture there that shows my grandfather and my great-grandmother, taken when it was probably about 1945, I would suppose, that was the picture taken. Now, Andrew, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather too, they were farmers. But I can tell you that the story about my great-grandfather, Knud Knudsen, was that he was not a very good farmer. And the reason given was that in Norway, and he was immigrated from Norway, and so was his wife, Annie. They were the immigrants, the first immigrants of our family. Now, Knud was apparently a kid that worked in a business in Norway, so he never did in Norway have anything to do with farming. So if you can imagine coming to a new country, and basically the only thing that you were given to be able to do would be to go and start a farm. What would you do if you never did that back home where you had come from? So that was a interesting part of the story from my sense of things. It might be of interest to you to know that Knud Knudsen, he was a child of his parents, and there were 7 children in his generation. So he had 6 brothers and sisters. And then Knud and Annie, they had 8 kids in their family, and my grandfather, Andrew, was the oldest of 8 children in that family, and I've told you he was born in 1895. So that's a little bit about their family sizes, and a little bit about how they were in the family order. Now, I would say that my grandfather and grandmother Ida and Andrew, they were people that were a part of my family because we went to the same church, we lived in the same community, we farmed around the same areas, and much of my uncles, my dad, by the way, he had 10, there were 5 of them in the family, 5 boys. There were 5 boys. My dad was the oldest of 5 boys. So they liked to play baseball and that sort of thing when they were kids. That was a favorite game. Oh yeah, and then they played horseshoes too. That was another favorite pastime in our family. But the point I'm going to get to with my grandparents was that they lived, when I was quite little, on what was called the section. And maybe you kids know about what a section is, and maybe you don't. A section is a square mile of land. So if you have roads going around the section, it would be a mile square on each side. Each road would be a mile long. And in this particular piece of ground, the driveway was in the middle of the section. So you had to go half a mile down the driveway to get to the house. And it was very flat land. There was no trees around to speak of. And so there was a big square house, and they were living in this big square house, and they were farming the section. Now, my grandfather, Andrew, he'd never owned any land. He only rented other farmers' land or land from a bank, if that was the case. Because they were living in a time when the depression was a big problem. Depression was sometime in the, 1929 is when there was a great collapse of the stock market, they called it, and people lost their jobs if they were in cities, and there was no money. And so for the farmers, they could grow crops, but nobody would buy it because there was no money that people had to buy it with. So there was a collapse of the economy that was very difficult. And Knud Knudsen, as I said, was not a very good farmer, supposedly, whatever that meant. And he did lose his land because he had gotten land from settling. That was how it was. The government provided an opportunity for people to come, and they would make a claim. They'd usually plant some trees and then build something on it, and that was their tree claim, and then they would own the land according to the government. And then that was where they would farm or do whatever they wanted to do, raise cattle maybe, or other animals for doing farming. So Knud lost his farm, and so in their old age, they were homeless, and they didn't have any place that they could call their own. So they had to rely on their children to take care of them. Now, Knud passed away before his wife, and so his wife, Annie, the lady in the picture I mentioned, she lived from one child to the next and to the other, and they'd kind of pass her around into their different homes during those periods of time, which she didn't like at all. And I suppose they didn't find it very easy as well, because she, was unhappy and I'm sure grieving her husband's loss. Lots of sadness there. Now, the saddest story about Annie Oswald Knudsen was that she was cooking on a wood stove which was a stove that you had in your house, and there was no electricity in this place, so they had to make the stove from burning wood. And somehow, as she was taking something off the stove, her apron caught on fire. And so she had this fire, and her clothes started to burn. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible thing. And I understand that she lived maybe a few days before she passed away. So she died tragically because of a fire. Very, very sad story. I, as I said, never knew her, but those were the stories that I was told. And you should know that as part of the history of our family, that somebody died in a very, very painful and terrible way with a fire. My father never forgot that experience. He saw her in those conditions, and that was a very sad thing for him to know and to experience his grandma like that. Now, I guess I can go on to say something about my grandfather now from my experiences of them. Grandma and Grandpa, to me, they were wonderful. I loved going and seeing them, and they were always, in my experience, they were always nice people to me. I remember staying overnight at their house, and some of my cousins, we did the same. And my oldest cousin is a lady now. She lives in California. Her name was Kathy, or is Kathy. And then my second oldest cousin was Terry, as a boy. And so it was me. I was the oldest cousin, and then Kathy, and then Terry, and the three of us. We spent time together as cousins at our grandma's, and I can tell you that my cousin Kathy, she remembered, and I didn't. She remembered that we were up in the attic of Grandma and Grandpa's house, and in a box or whatever it was, we opened up, and there was the wedding dress of my grandma. And so she said, in our play, she put on I suppose the veil or whatever it was of that, and then Terry, being a bit younger, so we had this little ritual, and apparently I married the two of them. I played the pastor, so I apparently was destined to be a pastor way back when I was just a little kid. But we were playing church, we knew that kind of thing, right, by growing up in church. So that's a memory of being at my grandma and grandpa's house as cousins. But I also remember another one when we were older, and we did a lot of running around. Like, I guess you kids do that too, don't you? Ever have? It's always fun to run and play. And we were playing, and it was at a different farm, not the one I described. There was another farm that my grandparents farmed that was not too far from the section farm that I mentioned. But anyway, that became the farm that I remember this to be. So it was getting dark, but us kids, we were running around the house, chasing each other. I don't know what game we were trying to play, but we were doing that. And you might know about clotheslines that are outside of the house. At least they used to be in many of our homes. And that was, about 3 lines of wire, basically, between 2 posts. And you could hang your clothes outside on the clothesline. Okay, so I'm running around following my cousins, and apparently I was just a little bit too tall, because when I was running around and it was dark, I ran into the clothesline, and the clothesline caught me right under the chin, which meant that my feet went flying ahead of me and I landed on my back. Pretty well knocked the breath out of me. And I'll never forget that experience of running in the dark and not seeing the clothesline and ending up, always. Now I knew after I did that, thou shalt not run in the dark into clotheslines. That was a bad idea. Oh, well, such memories. The other thing that I remember was they had a barn on this farm, the one that was their last farm that they rented, and the barn was kind of down a hill a little bit. And there was another cousin or second cousin of mine that had come from California and was staying with his mother and dad were staying with my grandparents, and so I was invited to come over and be with him. I've never forgotten that. But right now I don't remember his name. I'm sorry to tell you, but our fun was, I remember this as very, very vividly. We loved to throw rocks. There were a lot of little rocks that you could grab, from the ground, and it was a test to see whose strength was. We could throw the rock over the roof of the barn. I mean, that was a real interesting time as a kid to do something like that. Nobody was hurt. I don't know that the cows were on the other side of the barn to get the rock to come down and hit them, but we were, as a kids, we were having a lot of fun with that, he and I. I do remember about him. He was a young man, a boy who got, as I learned later, was diagnosed with some kind of childhood cancer, and his life ended very shortly after that. So I never got to know him well, but I certainly remember our experiences together, and I'll never forget him for that. But I do still have a little sort of a question about what happened and anything more about him and his life and who he was, even, because as a child I didn't have my understanding of the extended family at all. So that's my some childhood memories around my grandparents. I think I told you about an experience which was mine as a little kid, was that we did not have electricity at our house. When I was little, we had kerosene lamps and also oil lamps. And that's, if it was after dark, that's all we could use to see what was going on. It was a very minimum light. And one of the things that I did not know until later on, but my grandfather, Andrew, my dad's father, he was very interested in having the farms get electricity, because in town, in the smaller towns, they did have electricity at this time, and this is the late 1940s, mid to late 1940s. And so my grandfather joined together with some other farmers, and they joined to organize what became, in that area, the REA, the Rural Electrification Association. The Rural Electrification Association was possible because the government was interested in this, and so they wanted to support that. So it was a government program that supported the idea of running electric lines out to farms. The electric companies of the time, which did have people in town so that they could have electricity there. Well, when you have the houses really close together, you can string just a little bit of wire to the next house, to the next house, and so on. And so you can make a lot better money when you deliver electricity to people that are living really close together, when you had to run it through lines like that. Out in the farms, we were far apart from each other, and so you had to put a lot of wire and posts, and you see this around, don't you? The electric lines above along streets and so forth. Well, that we didn't have any of that until the electricity came along, and then we finally got it. So my grandfather, Andrew, was part of the group that was promoting and being part of the guidance toward the having electricity on our farms. And he stayed as a board member on the REA board for many years and served as this thing, and the electric company, of course, was developed, and the REA, as they called it, was a big success for our life out on the farms. My brother's wife, Karen, some of you know Karen or have met her, I think. She worked at the REA in Salem, South Dakota, when my brother was the funeral director in Salem, South Dakota. So she was working in the organization, in the the electric co-op, as they called it. That was possible in part because my grandfather, our grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, some of you, he was part of the group that wanted that and promoted it and made it possible. So that was his leadership and contribution. Besides being a farmer and being a grandpa, he did something that was very memorable and very important. I didn't talk about my grandmother yet much, but Ida is her name, Lundgren. Now, I'm going to tell you this story for the record. She was Swedish, and my grandfather and his family, they were Norwegian. And in those days, and that's not a joke, they didn't see eye to eye on how things should be, and they were from different countries, really, even though they were Scandinavian, I guess we could say. There was a valley road. There was a little creek road. They called it the Valley Road. It was a place that my grandfather was familiar with, and he was driving a Model T Ford car. And no, I'm sorry. I got this to. Okay, we'll start over on that one. Ida and Selma, the two sisters, my grandmother-to-be, and her sister, they had been to some event, and they were driving the Model T Ford. And they had a flat tire on the road. My grandfather was coming along with a buggy and a horse. He didn't have a car yet, so a buggy and a horse was his mode of transportation. And I'm told that he stopped, of course, to see what he could do, and the flat tire was the problem, and whatever he did, he apparently got them so they could drive the car again. And he kind of knew who these people were, but he'd never really had anything to do with them, these two girls. But apparently, and I have it on record of him telling this, there's an audio tape of him talking about this. He invited Ida to ride in his buggy, then he would take her home while Selma drove the car back home. As they say, that's how they met, and they became husband and wife. Now, another piece of the story was that my grandma Ida previously had been engaged to a young man. She she loved, and I don't know what his name was. But right before they were to be married, he died. Very tragic, unexpected thing. So she went through grief and loss right away in her young life, wanting to marry this man who then died. So my grandfather, we said, was kind of second best, you know. But they made a marriage, and they had five boys, and my father, of course, one of them. Well, there's a little bit about my grandparents, and my grandma, she was the one that cooked the lutefisk and the Swedish meatballs and the wonderful foods that I grew up on, and I think you can know that was her contribution to many ways. There is one story about her, though, that maybe you'd like to know, and that was she was a very religious person. In fact, we all grew up in a pretty religious community, and going to church was really important. But I'm told that Grandma, one of her jobs on the farm was that she milked the cows, and this was by hand milking of the cows. And my cousin Terry would tell me that she would take her Bible with her down to the barn, and while she was milking the cows, she had the Bible sitting there by her so she could put her mind off of something that would help her. I'm sure she had a tough life in that kind of time. Well, I think this is enough, and maybe you'll have some more questions, but I hope you enjoyed this reminiscence on my part to tell you about my grandma and grandpa, Andrew and Ida Knudsen. And thank you for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day. God bless you all.